Hi, I'm back with our final, second or third, I guess if you include the lab, and final lecture on tissues. So we're going to now talk about those 4 different types of tissues that we have mentioned already in the last 2 chapters. And we're going to talk about how they work together to form organs and body membranes. And then for the very last part, we're going to talk a little bit about how they've developed and what types of organs and body membranes develop from each of those embryonic tissues. So organs are made of 2 or more tissue types, and so usually most of them, or a lot of them have all 4, but many of them only have 2 or more, and they work together to perform very specific complex functions. So think of the liver, the stomach, the heart, all of these things do a lot of important things, and we'll learn a lot more about the function of each specific organ as we work through these, the rest of 168 and 169 and all of our organ systems. So within each organ, different structures must work together. Like in the heart, we need the muscle to pump, we need the valves to be in the right place to make sure that blood doesn't backflow. We need the endothelium to be nice and smooth to make sure that there's no rough blood flow or clotting or anything. The stomach, for example, is going to be lined by epithelium. So it secretes substances for the chemical digestion of nutrients. So we'll learn a lot. Now, you don't have to memorize everything specific for the stomach. This is just an example, and we'll learn more about it in 169 in digestion. But the epithelium is really important. It's going to secrete mucus to help protect the stomach itself from the stomach acid. It secretes lots of different digestive enzymes, right, to start digesting protein. Within the walls, we have areolar and dense connective tissue in the walls to kind of keep everything together and like make up the framework and connect everything together. Right? Connective tissue, one of the things it does is it connects things together. We also have blood vessels and nerves, and they're all going to be like sort of found within the areolar connective tissue. This also provides shape and support. There's 3 layers of smooth muscle, and also mention really quick, the blood vessels are lined by epithelium. The nerves are made of nervous tissue. 3 layers of smooth muscle are going to be within the walls of the stomach, going in all different directions so the stomach can churn and perform its mechanical digestion as well as its chemical digestion. And then there's lots of nervous tissue that's responsible for regulating the muscle contraction as well as secretion of those glands. So if we look at this picture here, we can see everything in green here that's highlighted green is going to be epithelial tissue. So we've got epithelial tissue on both the inside and the outside of the stomach, right? So this is the outside where if you were doing abdominal surgery, you'd see this. That's epithelium. That's going to be the visceral peritoneum, or the serosa layer. And then here we've got the epithelium here that lines the inside of the stomach, and it's going to be lined by this simple columnar epithelium here, and then it forms these gastric glands, right? Remember that epithelial tissue forms all the glands, so whenever we have these gastric glands, that's made of epithelial tissue. Now under here, we've got our connective tissue here, dense irregular connective tissue, some areolar connective tissue, got some areolar connective tissue down here, and all within this connective tissue area, we've got these blood vessels and nerves that are running. We've got different nerve plexuses. The blood vessels, again, are going to be lined by epithelial tissue. We haven't even zoomed in that far, so we haven't even mentioned it, but they're lined by epithelial tissue, and the blood vessels also have smooth muscle within their walls, depending on how big they are and where they are. And then down here we have this muscle tissue here. So this is smooth muscle since it's going to be lining the layers of the digestive tract, but it's important for contraction. And then we have each of the smooth muscle is going to have nerve plexuses between these muscle layers, right? Because we need nerve impulses to go to the muscle to cause it to contract. And so all of these tissue types are going to work together to make the really, really complicated organs that we'll be looking at in lab. And so, as I said, once again, you don't need to memorize this yet. This will be 169, but it's a good example of how everything works together. And our organs usually have at least 2 different types of tissue. Many of them have all 4. Now, the other things that our tissues can work together to form are called body membranes. So they're not quite organs, but they are membranes in the body. These are going to line body cavities, cover the viscera. Remember that viscera is a fancy word for organs. And it also covers the outside of the body, like the skin, and it's going to be lining the joints. So we have 4 different types: mucous membranes, serous membranes, cutaneous membranes, and synovial membranes. So mucous membranes are the first ones we'll talk about. And these are going to be lining all of the sort of cavities within your body that open to the outside world. So your digestive tract, your respiratory epithelium and the respiratory tract, your urogenital tracts. Anything here that opens to the outside world is going to be covered by these mucous membranes. And obviously, as the name implies, they're going to be covered by a layer of protective mucus. And so these mucous membranes are going to perform absorptive, protective, and secretory functions, right? We're secreting lots of mucus, stomach acid within the stomach. We're also absorbing things, especially in the digestive tract. And they are formed from epithelium and the underlying connective tissue. We call the connective tissue component that sits under the mucous membrane the lamina propria. And they're all covered with a layer of mucus that's derived from goblet cells, or in some cases multicellular glands, or both. So for the mucous membranes at least, the type of epithelial tissue that lines it is going to be different depending on where we're looking. So like an example, this is going to be, you might have simple columnar epithelium in the digestive tract. You might have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium in the trachea. In the mouth and the pharynx, you're going to have non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So the type of epithelium on these mucous membranes is going to vary as we move through it. Same thing in the reproductive tract and the urinary tract. That's going to be urinary tract is mostly transitional epithelium. So we have lots of different types of epithelium that are going to be making up the mucous membranes. So, but they are all covered in mucus, right? Because they're mucous membranes. And they line those cavities that are open to the outside world. Next, we have the serous membranes. And if you think back to our very first lab, we talked about the serous membranes. So we said that the ventral body cavities, so the thoracic cavity, which includes the pleura and the pericardium, as well as the abdominopelvic cavity, which is going to be lined by the peritoneum, they are going to be covered by these serous membranes. And these serous membranes are going to line the body cavities as well as cover the inside of the organs. And they're made of a simple squamous epithelium. We can call that a mesothelium also. So remember that these are flat, and we said that like the top of a cell can be flat, and that can sort of help reduce friction. So it's going to be reducing friction. Remember that the parietal serous membranes line the cavities, whereas the visceral serous membranes are going to cover the organs. And in between those two is going to be the serous cavity. And these serous membranes produce this thin, watery serous fluid. And the serous fluid is going to come from blood plasma, so it's a lot of water in it, and it reduces friction between the opposing surfaces. So as well as those simple squamous cells being nice and flat, they also produce this watery serous fluid that reduces friction. And so once again, the parietal layer is going to be lining the cavities, and the visceral layer is going to be covering the organs, and the serous cavity is between, and that's where the serous fluid is. And these all have those special names, right? So we call it the pericardium, where the heart is. So in the pericardial cavity, you have the pericardial serous membranes. In the pleural cavities, you have the pleural serous membranes and the pleural fluid. In the abdominopelvic cavity, you're going to have the peritoneum and the peritoneal membranes. Now, these line body cavities, like this ventral cavities that I said, that do not open to the outside. And so your heart, your lungs, your abdomen, none of these should open to the outside. Now, you can look back here. So that's going to be these serous membranes right here. We have that simple squamous epithelium sitting on top of connective tissue, and we have the serous fluid in between. Now the next one is the cutaneous membrane, and I'm only going to spend a little while on this because chapter 6 is all about the cutaneous membrane, and that's our next chapter. So this is the skin. It covers the outside of the body, the external surface of the body, and it's going to be composed of an outer layer of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium and an underlying connective tissue. So it's mostly going to be dense irregular connective tissue with some areolar and adipose connective tissue mixed in there. And this is going to protect the internal organs and prevent water loss. So once again, I'm not going to spend too much time on that because next chapter we'll be going into all of that information. Now the final one is the synovial membrane. And this one you may not be as familiar with yet, but if you think about joints, remember you have a joint cavity, and our joint cavity is not open to the outside, and this is going to be in our freely movable joints. So think about the joint cavity around your knee, for example. And so within that joint cavity, you have a lot of cartilage, and you have an area, like an opening, and this open joint cavity is going to be filled with synovial fluid, and it's going to be lined with synovial membrane. And so this synovial membrane is going to be, we'll talk more about this in chapter 9, we'll kind of come back to it, but it's composed of areolar connective tissue that's covered by squamous epithelial cells, and they actually don't have a basement membrane. So remember when we talked about basement membranes, we said not all of them have it, but these don't. And our synovial fluid is secreted by these epithelial cells, and they're going to reduce friction between, the moving bones and between the cartilage. And it also distributes nutrients to the cartilage because if you remember, we briefly mentioned in the histology chapter, and we'll talk about it again in the skeletal system chapter, that mature cartilage is avascular, and avascular means it does not have any vessels. And so the synovial fluid helps with that. So this is kind of similar to the serous membranes where they secrete this fluid that's going to help lubricate in that area. All right, now that we've talked about organs and body membranes, I want to move on to a little bit about how these tissues developed and what types of organs and membranes each type of tissue develops into. So in 169, we're going to go into a lot more detail with development, right? In our last chapter, chapter 29, we'll talk about fertilization and pregnancy and a little bit about development. We've got a lab on that, but I want to start here so that it's a little bit familiar for you when you get there. So when you are first formed, right? There was an egg and there was a sperm, and the oocyte or the egg was fertilized by the sperm, and it's going to form a diploid cell called a zygote. And that just means that there's 23 sets of chromosomes from mom and 23 from dad, and we're going to be this little zygote here. This zygote is going to, grow. It starts really tiny, its cells divide, and it grows, and eventually forms a blastocyst. You don't need to memorize all these terms yet. We'll get to, I'll talk about 3 primary germ layers is where we get to go. Within the blastocyst, you have outer layers here. It's like a big circle, and the outer part of this layer is going to form eventually the placenta. That's called the trophoblast. And then the inner layer, sometimes called the inner cell mass or the embryoblast, that's the cells that are going to form the embryoblast. And this embryoblast is going to eventually form what's called the 3 primary germ layers, and this is formed by about the 3rd week. So this is the part here I want you guys to look and start remembering, the 3 primary germ layers. It's going to form the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. And once these 3 primary germ layers have formed, we now, instead of calling it a zygote, are going to call it an embryo. So the ectoderm is going to be located on the back part and the external part, so like sort of the back and the outside of the embryo surfaces. And it's responsible for forming many of sort of the external structures. So this tissue is going to be forming eventually the epidermis of the skin, the hair, the nails, the exocrine glands, so all of the things we're talking about in next chapter. It's some, but not all, of our epithelial tissues are derived from the ectoderm. So a lot of them are going to be derived from the ectoderm. And then other structures that come from the ectoderm are things like the tooth enamel, the lens of the eye, the adrenal medulla, and all nervous tissue. So nervous tissue comes from the ectoderm too. So ectoderm is going to be coverings of things, so a lot of like epithelial tissues as well as all nervous tissues, and then some other kind of weird things that you don't need to necessarily memorize, but good to know. So the middle layer here is the mesoderm. This is the middle primary germ layer, and this forms all muscle tissue, right? So it also forms the epithelial linings of vessels and serous membranes, right? So this is some epithelial tissue too. So this is more the middle stuff. And it also becomes the mesenchyme, so it forms all the connective tissue in the body. So far, mesoderm has formed all the muscle tissue and all the connective tissue in the body. And some other mesoderm-derived structures are the dermis, right, which is some connective tissue, adrenal cortex, the heart, which has some muscle tissue in it, right, spleen, kidneys, ureters, internal reproductive structures. So we've got the mesoderm forming the muscle tissue as well as the mesenchyme, which is going to form the connective tissue in the body. The ectoderm forms the nervous tissue, and then the endoderm is going to be the innermost germ layer. And then the endoderm is going to form things like the epithelial linings of in the inner ear, the tympanic cavity, and the auditory tube, so like inside things. The epithelial linings of the digestive tract, the respiratory and reproductive and urinary tracts. These glands here, which are all also derived from thyroid, parathyroid, and thymus, they're going to be derived from epithelial tissue, the palatine, tonsils, and most of the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. And the pancreas, again, has some glandular tissue in it too. So this is primarily, the endoderm has a lot of epithelial stuff, coming from it. It's like the innermost layers. The mesoderm is the middle. It forms muscle tissue as well as connective tissue and some epithelial lining. And then the ectoderm forms some more epithelial. So all three layers form some of these epithelial linings, and then specifically all nervous tissue. So this picture here is going to show us this is the fertilization happens, then we become the zygote. Here's the blastocyst. So this outer layer here is going to eventually form the placenta. That's the trophoblast. And this inner layer here called the inner cell mass or the embryoblast will eventually become the embryo. And so we have the ectoderm on top, the mesoderm in the middle, and the endoderm below right here. And so eventually it goes through a bunch of different complicated folding, and these eventually are going to form the different tissues of the body, right? So ectoderm is going to be the nervous tissues and sense organs, the epidermis of the skin and the outer stuff, the pituitary gland, adrenal medulla, things like that. Both of those are going to be secretory. They secrete a lot of stuff. The mesoderm is going to be the dermis of the skin, the epithelial linings of the blood vessel, all the muscle tissue, all the connective tissue, and a lot of different organs here, kind of the middle stuff, heart, kidneys, lungs, or not lungs, heart, kidneys, ureters, reproductive organs, the spleen, and then finally the endoderm is like a lot of epithelial linings of things as well as some other organs and glands. So this is just kind of a little bit of how the tissues are formed and what they eventually become. So as I said, mesenchyme, it comes from the, as we can see right here, the mesoderm. The mesoderm becomes the mesenchyme, and the mesenchyme is the source of all other connective tissue cells. An adult connective tissue cell often has the mesenchymal stem cells. So if we say there's a mesenchymal cell or a mesenchymal cell, that's going to be one of those, stem cells that's been brought forward from the embryo, and it's still there, and eventually it can become a bunch of different types of cells. Mucous connective tissue is another sort of embryonic connective tissue, but it's only found in the umbilical cord. And so this is going to be some of that like tissue from the umbilical cord that is going to be formed in the embryo. So briefly, we mentioned about the different, where all the tissues come from, and we said that these mesenchymal cells are sort of like stem cells. And so what is a stem cell? And stem cells are just these cells that have the ability to form into different types of cells. They have not decided exactly what type of cell they're going to become yet. And there's a couple different types of stem cells. So we have these, you've probably heard in the media for years, we talked about embryonic stem cells. And these embryonic stem cells originate from the dividing cells in the zygote or the embryoblast portion of the blastocyst. And they may be totipotent or pluripotent. So these words mean slightly different things. So totipotent means that these cells can form the total cell. So I think totipotent, it can form everything. They're from these first couple of cells here. These cells have not differentiated at all. They can give rise to every different cell in the organism as well as the placenta because they're at the very beginning. So they're totipotent. Pluripotent is going to be these embryoblasts or inner cell mass cells. So if we took one of those out, this one has the capability to mature and to specialize into any cell within the body except the placenta, right? Because this part right here, the trophoblast, this is where the placenta comes from. So these have already decided, they're already differentiated, they've decided they're becoming the embryo, not the placenta. So we can take this one, this is pluripotent, to get stem cells there. But we also have adult stem cells. And adult stem cells are sort of those mesenchymal cells we were talking about before. They are the undifferentiated. And so differentiated means that the cell has decided what it's going to be. So undifferentiated means that it has not decided what it's going to be. It has not turned into like an adult type of cell. So these are undifferentiated stem cells, or like, so those mesenchymal cells that are, they're still that stem cell from the beginning. And they're still in the body after birth. And they could be multipotent or unipotent. And so multipotent stem cells, both of these are less useful. So totipotent can become everything, including the placenta. Pluripotent can become anything in the body, but not the placenta. Multipotent, they're capable of differentiated into a few different cell types, but not others. So, for example, maybe in the red bone marrow, you might have some stem cells here that can become any type of blood cell. They could become a red blood cell or a white blood cell or a platelet or, any type of red blood cell. But it couldn't necessarily become, a skin cell. It's going to become, one of a restricted number of different cells. Usually they're related to one another. They're kind of similar. Whereas a unipotent stem cell, this is like an epithelial stem cell, they have the ability to differentiate into a single type of cell. So like here, down in the stratum basale, we'll talk about this in the next chapter, we have all these little cells here that are constantly dividing to replace your skin. But they're always, so they're stem cells, they can always divide, but they're always going to become skin cells. They're not going to be able to turn into, something else. All right, now the last part of this is going to be a lot of terminology associated with tissues. And especially this first part is tissue modification. So if we modify a tissue, we can use these different words, or if the tissue, becomes modified, these words can describe the changes in those tissues. So hypertrophy is the increase in size of the existing cells in a tissue. So let's say you have an adipose cell and, it was small, but then you eat a lot of French fries and it gets bigger. It's hypertrophied. We didn't get more of them necessarily, but it got bigger. Hyperplasia would be increase in the number of cells in a tissue. And so like we were looking here, obviously we started with 1 cell and now we have 4 and now we have 8 and now we have 16. So that's going to be like hyperplasia. We're increasing the number of cells in a tissue. And that's a little bit less common. Hypertrophy is a little bit more common in like the adult when we're not. Obviously, hyperplasia happens a lot when we're growing, like in the long bones and things. But once you're adult, it's hypertrophy is a little bit more common. Atrophy is kind of the opposite. It's the shrinkage of a tissue by the decrease in either the cell number or the cell size. And this is either due to normal aging or it can be due to disuse. So think about if you have broken an arm or something, or you're bedridden and you can't use your muscles, the skeletal muscle fibers become smaller, right? If you don't use it, you lose it. So that's sort of atrophy. And this is usually reversible with physical therapy. So you can gain it back. You just have to work for it. Now, other ways that tissues can change. One of them is called metaplasia. Metaplasia is the changing of a mature epithelium to a different form. So, if we have simple squamous epithelium and it turns into simple cuboidal or something. And this can occur as an adaptive response to the environment. So an example, smokers, they're going to have a metaplastic changes in the trachea epithelium. And if you remember from the last class, we said that our trachea is lined by the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. But when smokers are inhaling all that smoke with all those like particles and debris, it's kind of not very healthy for that, for the individual in general. And so that non-keratinized or that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium is going to change and become non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium because that is more protective, right? So we have lots of different layers of that. So if the first couple of layers get hurt, then this can be changed. This can quickly revert back if the person quits smoking. So if you smoke, quit smoking. Dysplasia then is, I guess, a little bit further from metaplasia. This is a little bit more abnormal. So dys means there's like an abnormality, so an abnormal growth. So we've got like trophy or plasia. These are both kind of like, this is growth in size. This is kind of growth in number. Metaplasia, it's like strange, different, a change in growth. Dystrophy, dish is usually like abnormal. This is abnormal growth or abnormal development. This can be precancerous, or it could revert back to normal. So it's like if the doctor's like, oh, it might be precancerous, we're not sure, we're going to watch it. It's probably dysplasia. And so it's just like the tissue is not developing normally, and they're going to watch it. And so cervical dysplasia, so in the cervix, this is what you get when you get a pap smear. What they're looking for is cervical dysplasia, because it can be caused by human papillomavirus or other things. Obviously, if they see it, they'll just want to monitor it and see if it gets better or if it gets worse. And then finally, neoplasia. This is a new tissue growth or out of control tissue growth. And this neoplasia is like another term for a tumor, right, or abnormal tissue growth. Benign means that this tissue growth is localized and it doesn't spread. So we just have this like abnormal tumor or this abnormal area, but it's not going to spread. Whereas malignant means that it's more likely to what we call metastasize. Metastasize or metastasis is when those cancer cells or those, cells that are growing out of control, they actually spread from one area of the body to another, and then you have like lots of these tumor cells everywhere. And this is usually when we call it cancer, if it's malignant and metastasizing, or if it interferes with normal functioning, and it can lead to death eventually. Now, the final thing we'll talk about is going to be necrosis. So necrosis is a type of tissue death, and this is due to irreversible tissue damage. So we mentioned apoptosis in the mitosis section, which is like the cell deciding to undergo cell death, and that there is no inflammatory response there. It's kind of like a normal, or it can be normal. Whereas necrosis is opposite. This is usually damage to the tissue. And there is an inflammatory response to that tissue damage, and it causes lots of problems. Like gangrene is an example where the tissue is dying and there's a bad infection and inflammatory disease. So I did want to mention a little bit about the aging of tissues. And so all tissues are going to change as you age. And as we go through each different chapter in the book, we'll talk a little bit about aging of the different systems. So proper nutrition, good health, normal circulation, and infrequent wounds are all going to be important to promoting normal functioning of your tissues. And normal circulation, right, that's things that are, it's pretty important. Things like high blood sugar can influence, or high blood pressure, so diabetes or hypertension, things like that can affect your circulation. After middle age, your cells that are dividing to make the fibers and things become less active, and they're not going to be able to make, and the mitotic cells are less active, and so we're not going to be able to replace the cells or extracellular material as often and as well. So our tissues don't necessarily heal as well or as quickly after middle age. And then the structure and chemical composition of many tissues can be altered. So usually your epithelial cells your epithelia can thin, so the skin gets thinner, the connective tissue is not as pliable and it loses its resilience, collagen can decline, bones can become more brittle, and muscles can atrophy. So those are kind of, some of it is common sense. You've probably thought about this before, like if you've, seen your grandparents and things like that, you can kind of, or any older individuals, you may have noticed some of these changes. All right, so that is all I have for you for tissues today. And we're going to pick up next week talking about the integumentary system. And also this week lab, we'll talk about the integumentary system.